I'm like a lot of authors in that I've spent a fair amount of time listening to writing advice and feeling swamped by it because there's a lot of writing advice out there, and unfortunately, most of it is just not very good. It's very samey, it's very shallow, it doesn't really give you tools, just guardrails. It's more about telling you what not to do than telling you what to do. So I feel like what's lacking most is not good advice. It's how to tell good advice from bad advice when it comes to writing. I've mentioned before on this channel two of the big influences on me in terms of learning good writing advice, Professors Ken McRory and Peter Elbow, and they showed me what good writing advice could be like and what the hallmarks of that good advice are. So from them, I've derived a few ideas which are not about particular suggestions to follow, but how to make sense of the suggestions that you're given. So here I have two key things to look for with any piece of writing advice, two questions to ask yourself about it to figure out its value to you. And the first question is this advice binary? Does it come in the form of do this, don't ever do that? Because I found when phrased this way, it's rarely good advice. And it's not because those specific recommendations don't have some truth to them. It's because saying never or always will rob the advice of context. Let me give you an example we're probably all familiar with. People who say things like, don't use adverbs. And that, I think, is a backlash against all the way adverbs can be used thoughtlessly. See, I just used one there for myself. Adverbs are accents. They add context and flavor to something that wasn't there to begin with. So if you say something was done thoughtlessly, for instance, that's a signal that the specific way that it was done was inattentive, and that just describing how it was done wouldn't necessarily convey that aspect of it. So an adverb can add information and color, but it can also be redundant and overused. And so people will advise you instead to use nouns and verbs that give your work more color and specificity and strength, that don't need adverbs to color them in. So the first thing to look for with questionable advice is the never always construction. Does this have a binary flavor to it? And to understand that such advice is worth considering if you take the binary part of it out of the equation. And that leads us to the second question. Is this advice expressible in terms of a cost-effectiveness formula? And to my mind, this is the most useful and constructive kind of advice you can give someone. It's when you lay out for them the benefits and the costs of doing something in a specific way. In the form of, if you do this, it will be easier or harder to do this. If you do that, this is your trade-off. So you can do this unusual thing in your story. You can have this unusual structure with it, but it will come at the cost of the story being that much harder to parse or getting in the way of other things. Here's a common example of a cost-effectiveness trade-off is when we talk about choosing a POV for a story. A third-person POV in a story that follows a single character and only gives us insight into that one character's thoughts and no one else's, that's a legitimate choice. But it leaves us without the ability to know what anyone else in the story is thinking. That's the trade-off. The thing is, sometimes you want to make that trade-off because it gives your story specificity and focus. This story is about this person, and the narrative itself supports that. I tend to favor this POV mode myself for exactly that reason. It means that I'm taking a stand as a creator on who this story is about and how it is about them. Now, we can use multiple points of view if we want to, and that can give a story a polyphonic or kaleidoscopic view of things and the goings-on, but it comes at a cost. It comes at the cost of changing up viewpoints throughout, which means that we're constantly upending the way the narrative works. We're stopping everything and switching views, and that can be exhausting to the writer and the reader alike. And I found that if you have a story that has a big ensemble cast, you don't necessarily need to follow every single person on that cast from the inside. You can pick a few privileged people and make them the center of things. A good example of this would be Frank Herbert's Dune. It's primarily told through the eyes of Paul Atreides, secondarily his mother and father. But there's never any question that it's Paul's story, and that's where the lion's share of the narrative is from his privileged point of view. So every decision in a story is going to come at the cost of something else, and those costs are not immediately visible. They're also not always catastrophic. Sometimes they're very small costs. Sometimes they're costs that are well worth paying to get the things that you want from them. But the point is, nothing comes without a cost. And the better acquainted you are with those costs, the easier it's going to be to make the decisions that complement the story that you have at hand. So good writing advice is about balancing the costs of one decision against another, waking you up to what those costs amount to. And good writing teachers can draw on the experiences of other writers or their own experience to talk about those costs. And the other important thing is they will not criticize you for making any one choice. They will not say that it's a bad thing to make a choice, but they will say something like, well, you chose to tell this story from 10 different POVs, and that's going to come at the cost of not having any one of those POVs be the most significant. And it's also going to come at the cost of constantly changing up the context that the story happens in. We're constantly switching around and jumping heads. Is that what you want? Is that the price you are willing to pay to make the story the way that you have it? At the end of the day, you can write any story any way you want to. It's all up to you. But what you should never do, I just made that a binary, what you should avoid, if you can, is not being conscious of what those choices will amount to. Don't cut yourself off from knowing what those choices are going to cut you off from, because every choice removes about as many opportunities as it puts on the table. And again, that's often a good thing, because selectivity and framing are an important part of how art works and how entertainment works. One of my favorite directors has a great line, Martin Scorsese, and he said, cinema is about what's in the frame and what's out of it. It's about knowing what's worth keeping and what's worth eliding, what's worth pointing the camera at, what's worth leaving it out of view, what's worth leaving on the cutting room floor. So you want to know what's being left in and out of the picture with each of the choices that you're making, and that will better equip you to pick what makes your story hum. Now, one final note, this is the kind of thing that you want to use on your own as a research program when you're reading other people's work and thinking about it. So if you start reading a story and you're seeing choices that were made by the author that you don't agree with, this is a way to interrogate that feeling. Or maybe you start reading somebody else's work and you find yourself agreeing a little too readily with the choices that they have made. So you can ask yourself in either of those cases, what is the motive on the author's part for these decisions? Why did they think this would work? What was the payoff that they saw for making the choices that they did? And then you can proceed from there as you read to figure out whether or not those choices were worth it in those works and also in works of your own, whether those choices are worth emulating in the things that you create. So those are the two big questions to ask yourself with advice. Is this advice binary? Is it expressed in terms of a cost-effectiveness formula? Those two things, I think, really help you pick good, workable advice for the decisions that you're going to need to make with every story that you produce. So try those out. See what you think.